one, Joey Castillo. So Joey also has a role at Oshawa as an open healthware engineer replicating healthware devices. Joey is a software and hardware engineer and is the technologist in residence here at Cornell Tech in New York City. He's also the founder of Oddly Specific Objects, an electronic practice that publishes open hardware designs and manufactures open hardware products in the wearable and hobbyist space. So with that, Joey, come take it away.
Thanks so much, Eve. Let me get my slides up here. All right, cool. So as Eve mentioned, my name is Joey Castillo. Clicker, obviously. And coming up with a name for this talk was hard, but I ended up on why do we do what we do, which I promise is not going to be mopey and existential, but is actually going to be filled with action items that we can think about. So as mentioned, I am the technologist in residence here at Cornell Tech, as well as the open healthware engineer here at Oshawa. And in that role, we've been talking a lot about replicating open hardware devices and stuff like that. So I was initially going to give a talk about just like, hey, welcome to Cornell Tech. Here's cool stuff we do in our lab. But this question of why we do what we do has kind of permeated a lot of my discussions here at the Oshawa grant. It's also a question that I think a lot about in my own practice, because in addition to being technologist in residence here at Cornell Tech and healthware engineer at Oshawa, I also make and sell my own open hardware objects, like a sensor watch, this board swap for a old Castillo wristwatch that I'm wearing on my wrist, that turns it into a kind of a wearable sensing platform, and the open book, my kind of long-standing attempt to build an open source ebook reader. So I kind of broke the talk into two sections. First, open hardware before bringing it back to open healthware. And I thought this might be important because a lot of folks in this room come from different lenses, different places, and not everyone might know exactly what we mean by open hardware. So yeah, as Eve kind of alluded to, the existing Oshawa certification asks you to share open source design files, software, if there is any, and documentation. And that's kind of like the gist of what's required to get an Oshawa certification right now. These items come from the, and in making the open book, this is an open hardware object. That means that I'm sharing my schematic diagrams, I am sharing my board design files. All of these things are open source and you can download them and look at them and do what you want with them. But why? Why do I do that? Why do we do this open hardware thing? So I put up the open hardware definition, which is kind of long here, like this is the first clause of it. Open hardware is hardware whose design is publicly available, study, modify, distribute, make, sell. It mentions preferred formats, but there's this sentence at the end that I feel like gets to a lot of people's why for doing open source hardware, giving people the freedom to control the technology in their lives. And this is a big why, I think, and I think a lot of folks come to it from here. But I kind of want to go back to the first sentence here because there are some whys embedded in these sort of action words right here. We want to make hardware that people can study, hardware that people can modify, distribute, make, and sell. And each of these are their own sort of whys that can kind of inform the way that we make open hardware. I have this quote from Bunny Huang that I absolutely adore. It's from an old blog post on liberating a smartwatch from the cloud services it was attached to. Bunny writes, the point of open source is not to ritualistically compile our stuff from scratch. It's the awareness that technology is not magic, that there's a trail of breadcrumbs that any of us could follow to liberate our digital lives. So I read this and I think to myself, cool, what are those breadcrumbs? And more importantly, can those breadcrumbs be different depending on the why we bring to our work? So yeah, if open source hardware is hardware whose design is made publicly available so that people can study, modify, distribute, make, and sell it, how do those action verbs change the kind of documentation that I share? And crucially for us, with the bigger set of whys motivating people to make open healthware, are there other design documents and artifacts that we need to consider that may not be part of the original open hardware definition? So again, I said this first half is open hardware, then we're going to bring it back to healthware. I use open hardware as this lens because the open book is a device that I've designed a whole bunch of times with several different whys. And I figured before we get into the healthware whys, we can talk about the hardware whys. So when I was first designing it, I kind of had this habit of covering every square inch of my silk screen with explanatory text, giving me the nickname the Dr. Bronner's of PCB design. But I did like the idea that in addition to publishing the files online, the silk screen kind of was a front and center piece of documentation that folks could like see when they got the object in hand. I can't get rid of that thing. Whatever. So I used the silk screen when I was thinking that I was making a device for people to study to explain how the device worked. So you could read about how the power supply worked or how the language data was stored in a flash chip. Like explaining how the thing worked was a way to make open hardware that someone could study. But later on, when I wanted to ship it out as kits that people could assemble themselves, I used my silk screen as step-by-step instructions. The idea that this is optimized for making. You go follow step 1, you follow step 2, you follow all the steps, you end up with a working open hardware gadget. These both fit the definition of open source hardware, but by putting different things front and center, I had a different why in mind. Hardware you can modify. When I wanted people to start hacking on the firmware, I put pin definitions and notes about how to develop software for it on the board itself. The idea being, I am inviting you to hack this thing rather than just make this thing. Hardware you can distribute. At some point, I got sick and tired of mailing out kits. So I was like, just fine, make it on your own. Like, have a factory do it. So I shared the Gerber files you would need to send to a place like JLC PCB and a BOM with the actual part numbers from LCSC you would need to send it. So you could just take these 3 files, send it to a factory in China, and get 5 open books in a week. And again, the why of distributed manufacturing is different from the why of like understanding it if it's a device that I want to sell. I'm basically inviting you to eat my lunch here. And for me, that why made sense. And as far as hardware you can sell, I've even gone so far as to give talks where I open up like the internals of my business and talk about my cost of goods sold, my margins, and like the prices that like why the price I charge you is not the price that I pay for it. I can see this being very uncomfortable for some people in open hardware, but for me, for my practice, this is what I want to do. This is my why. So yeah, I will be the first to admit, some of this might not be you, and lots of folks come to open source hardware with different whys in mind. And I'm going to repeat, the OSHWA certification doesn't require many of the things that I just showed. It merely asks for open source design files, software, if any, and documentation. So yeah, back to the open healthware piece. With a bigger set of whys motivating our reasons for making open healthware, are there other design documents and artifacts that we need to think about? Which brings us to section 2, open healthware. So yeah, we've been examining, or at least in the OSHWA grant, I was brought on to examine open hardware through the lens of replicability. Can we make this in our lab, right? So yeah, open source design files obviously include our schematics and Gerbers and things we need to fabricate the device, 3D printing, STL files, what have you. But as Eve mentioned, test and calibration procedures could also be crucial here because we made it. How do we know it does what we wanted it to do? How do we know it works? Does design files include assembly instructions, or is it something that should be obvious? Do we need a bill of materials? I think this was a question that came up in pretty much every meeting that we had. Sometimes the bill of materials can be the secret sauce to making something work. But if you're trying to be open, do you need to include that? Also, a BOM sometimes includes many parts. Sometimes one part's out of stock. If the part's unavailable, should we explain how to select an alternate part? Or if a part isn't readily available, do we need to suggest a qualified vendor? Because vendors can also be secret sauce, right? A good example of this is in the course of the OSHWA replicability studies, 3 of my master students actually replicated PicoRic, a open source ultrasound sensing device, in order to explore new modalities around ultrasound sensing for bone density. So this is an open hardware device that they basically downloaded the BOMs, downloaded the Gerbers, fabricated it, assembled it in our lab in Cornell Tech, and yeah, started exploring ultrasound sensing using this open hardware design. So that is replicability right there, right? Having said that, distributed manufacturing, while kind of having this similar like rhyme with replicability, might have different constraints, right? Can people make it on their own? This could be distributed DIY manufacturing or distributed mass production. This was something that came up in a meeting last week with Victoria from Open Source Medical Supplies. There's these feeding tube connectors that seem to be falling out constantly. And people who like have to care for a loved one and deal with these feeding tubes make 3D printed retainers for them that like solve their problem and then share these STL files in Facebook groups. This is open source hardware, like sharing problems in the community and finding solutions, right? But the Glia tourniquet's also a good example of optimizing for distributed manufacturing, but in this case, focusing on mass production in distributed supply chain, disrupted supply chains when you're in a war zone and you need to like 3D print on your own. So yeah, these might have different, like if you're trying to replicate at scale for real world impact, what would you share more about, right? Would you share more about costs? Field Ready actually has in their database production costs associated with many of their open source designs, which kind of makes sense, right? If you're going to try to like take a device and deploy it in the field, you might want to know what you're getting into in terms of expected costs. Maybe it's not actually cost effective or you need to optimize the design. This might be something that's uncomfortable to share if you're selling a device, but if your why includes getting people to make it on their own, this might be important. Risk analysis is another good example. Field Ready also shares risk analysis of all of their things, where someone's actually like gone through the design and evaluated the risks, both to the people making the device, i.e. you could burn yourself on the 3D printer, and people using the device where, oh, the hazard is the device could become unclamped, right? So this kind of risk analysis, again, is not currently required by the open source hardware certification. But as we talk about why are we putting open healthware out there, these might be the kinds of documents that we want to share. Do we need documentation of crucial design decisions? This came up in a conversation with the Glia folks, where the tourniquet's print orientation actually has a huge impact on its physical strength, which you need in a tourniquet. So if you just lob the STL files over the fence and expect people to print them, that might not actually work in the field unless you also document the fact that you need to print these STL files with a certain orientation. Otherwise, your thing's not going to work. So yeah, in the case of deployment in the field, I'm wondering how do the deliverables look different if your why includes a lot more people that aren't open hardware people in the lab, but are people out there doing the work? A couple of other lenses, and these are not by any means exhaustive. Open hardware for repairability. It occurs to me that a lot of folks get into open hardware because they want to fix things and mend things and keep things in service for longer. So yeah, maybe you can't make the entire thing yourself, but can you repair it? So yeah, obviously design files from the replicability frame might still apply here, but do you need a disassembly guide possibly for this kind of thing? Revalidation procedures. After you've done a repair, how do you know that it's working the way it's supposed to or the way it worked before? Troubleshooting guides. And here, there's actually not quite open source hardware, but iFixit has a really good kind of framework for this, where their guides describe how to troubleshoot and debug and disassemble and reassemble devices. This is for a Cardinal Health ventilator unit, which is not an open source hardware device, but by documenting these faults and giving people the power to diagnose them themselves, yeah, we're opening up something about the hardware. And if you were making an open hardware device like this, what kinds of guidance might you include if you're trying to help people to repair it, even if they can't build it from scratch? So yeah, this why might lead to less documentation in some places and more documentation in others. But the point I'm trying to get at with this talk is just thinking through those whys before, before putting your stuff forward. And yes, we do still hope that you fulfill the open hardware definition of open source design files, documentation, and software. But again, some of this may not be you. There are lots of folks in this room with lots of different whys for what they're doing. And the point in this talk was to just, again, asking this question, why do we do what we do? Not as a mopey existential question, but as an action verb question of, with our given why, what information do we put forward? So yeah, it's worth thinking about and articulating the reasons you want to be open. And it is fine if those reasons aren't the same as everyone else here, right? But I think the reason this is important to me is beyond the baseline of just open design files, we do expect the open healthware ecosystem to develop new norms and practices around what ought to be shared to accomplish the goals we're all setting out to achieve. And that's, I think, what this conference and these meetings are all about, figuring out those norms as a community. So that is the talk that I have for y'all. And yeah, thank you.